everybody for coming along. What we're going to do is we thought we would talk a bit about our project and how we got it going, and maybe some of the differences between working in a rural area and other areas. But we're very aware that, you know, there's as many different ways to do a project as there are artists, and as many different ways as there are places. So all we're doing is just sort of telling you a few of our experiences that might be relevant or might not. But we thought if we got Ginny along as well with another viewpoint, you know, that's sort of two different viewpoints. And then at the end, we're going to have a bit of time when people can chip in and give their own experiences as well. Anyway, I'll just bash on. So I'm Mary Bourne, and my collaborator in Cabrach Reconnections is Lynn Strachan. We're both visual artists based in Moray. We have worked before on various public realm type projects, but we had never actually collaborated. So Cabrach Reconnections was funded by Creative Scotland with money from the National Lottery through the Open Fund. And the question we're asking tonight is how to run a successful arts project. And as I say, there are lots of different ways of doing this, but I'll tell you how we went about this one, how it came about. So the first thing I'd say, and one of the things I'd say, is that a lot of these things aren't just for rural arts projects, but for projects more generally. And also, forgive me if I am, what was I going to say? If I'm stating the obvious, but sometimes you just, you know, it's easy to overlook the obvious, I find. So, but the first thing I was going to say is motivation is really, really important. If you're going to run a project, you are probably going to put in far more work than you ever expected you would, and there will be quite stressful things along the way, and it's really important that you're committed to what you're doing, because otherwise it'll just be a burden. So choose a place or a context that you love and are fascinated by, and also think about it in terms of your own work and the continuity of your own work, because although it can be good to try new things, also just sort of think about where you're coming from and where you're going to in your own work. One of the things that funding applications really like is self-contained projects with a beginning, a middle and an end. But of course, your life doesn't work like that. Well, it does, but on a much longer time scale. So just think about where you've come from and where you might go to after the project as well. So anyway, this is the place that Lynn and I fascinated. This is the Cab, which is the Moray side of the Aberdeenshire border. And you can see it's very beautiful. There are grouse moors and farmland, forestry. There are also some wind farms, which aren't in this picture. The mountain at the back there is the Buck of Cabrach, and then the River Devon actually rises at the foot of the Buck of Cabrach and winds down through the Cabrach. And we've both been visiting the Cabrach for quite a while and are quite fascinated by it, largely because of the way the history is still soapscape, and other parts of Scotland also have this, like Caithness. But everything is still just sort of lying around, and there are all these deserted buildings which look very derelict, but actually within living memory they were lived in, and there were families you know, leading their lives there. And they vary from huge buildings like this is Blackwater Lodge, which is several miles from the road, to much more humble places like this. This is called Powneed, and when you look, this is what you see, that thing has been tidied up, people just left, and everything's there and hasn't been cleared. And you can talk to people who live nearby who remember the people living in this house, and there's this tension between the remembered history and the sort of reality of the present state of these things, which is quite interesting and quite sad, really. During lockdown, Lynn and I, like everybody else, were sitting at home and thinking about things, and then when it eased, we went for a walk in the Cabrach up to the Doranel wind farm there at the end of lockdown, and we're talking about how we had we worked out over 50 years of experience between us of working in public realm and engagement and so on, and how we really love this place and how we'd love to work here. And perhaps we should try putting a project together ourselves and sort of write a brief for ourselves using our experience, and see if we could make it work as successfully as possible, not just for us, but for the local area, and sort of think about all the different audiences and so on, and just see what happened. So two sort of key things that we were building on, and this again isn't just about rural projects, but generally, is time for research and development, because when you're an artist, that everything depends on research and development stage, and because it's the one bit where people can't see what you're doing, it's the one bit that tends not to be allocated funding. And I mean, I'm sure a lot of you know that the sort of project you should steer clear of is the one where they ask for designs before you've even started the project, because that's a sure sign people don't understand the importance of this development stage. So we wanted to give ourselves plenty of time for that. And we wanted to use lots of different strategies for engaging with people, instead of just, workshops are great, but there are lots of different ways of engaging with people in a more natural way. And finally, the last thing we were really keen to do was to work near where we live. As we live in Moray, where there's been quite low arts provision. So we've tended to travel out with Moray a lot. So we were very keen to work where we live, both so we're contributing to our own area, and because we understand the place where we live better, and we've got established relationships here, which sort of makes it a richer understanding, but also means that you can hit the ground running. You don't have to spend all that time meeting people and getting to know them and working out who you want to work with and so on. That's all in place from the start, so it's a bit more efficient. It's also more efficient in terms of time and money, in that you don't have to spend so much time and money traveling elsewhere, being exhausted for traveling around Scotland. So those were all the reasons that we wanted to work locally. And this is where we are. The red dot is the blue dot my house, and Lynn's up in Elgin, up by the Moray Firth, and we're to the northeast of the Cairngorms, in rather a sort of forgotten and empty hinterland there. We zoom in a bit. The Cabrach divides into the upper Cabrach. Can you see my cursor moving? Yes. So there's this, can you see this circular basin? There's this circular shallow basin up here. And this is the River Devon rising below the Buck and winding through the upper Cabrach. So that's the upper Cabrach, then goes through this little gully where there's like a three-way confluence between the Blackwater, the Harrach and the Devon, and that runs on down. So that's the lower Cabrach. These little white dots are wind farms. And then the last thing that we thought would be nice would be to work together. And I mean, it's really great to collaborate on lots of levels in lots of situations, but particularly perhaps in a rural area where there isn't a big arts infrastructure, really nice to have someone to work with. So we got funding from Creative Scotland, which frankly was a miracle that we were both extremely grateful for. And of course, I don't know why we got the funding exactly, because they don't tell you exactly, but these are some of the things that I think we maybe managed to articulate quite well in our application. We were really clear about our motivation, both from our point of view and from what we felt we could give to the area that we were working. We'd got several project partnerships from the outset. So we had support from the Community Association, the Local Development Trust, local primary school, Scottish Sculpture Workshop and Vanilla Ink Jewellery Workshop. They'd all said they would work with us in the project. And while we made sure we hit the funders' priorities, the project had its own shape, and what we did was explained how the project hit their priorities rather than designing the project to hit their priorities, if you see what I mean. And then finally, we got someone who has done a lot of fundraising to read the application and just make sure. And she just tweaked it a little bit for us to make it more coherent. So there we were, we got our money and we were ready to go, headed up to the Cabrach. And for the first few months, we just spent a lot of time there, because although we'd been visiting the place, it had just been like sort of walks and hadn't done a lot of research. So we tried to develop a rounded understanding using lots of different strategies, giving ourselves time to understand and then time to respond and develop. So the first strategy was walking. Walking and walking. And I mean, there's no substitute really for being in the place and understanding. And for example, one of the things we noticed was no matter how remote the farmhouse, and some of them are quite a few miles from the road, but you could always see a couple of other farmhouses from each farmhouse. So even though you were remote, you always had neighbours within sight. So, you know, you couldn't really have got that from reading, probably, I don't think. We walked individually and with each other, and then sometimes we asked some people to come with us. So this is a chap called Colin Mackenzie, who's a whiskey historian, and this is him taking us up on a very mysterious day to look at illicit stills hidden in the mountains. So that was really fab, just to get some other people's perspective. We looked at the grouse moors. Now that little hut, I've just recently learned, is called the luncheon hut. That's where you eat your smoked salmon sandwiches. We went through the farmland and spent a lot of time walking in the farmland, and that was really great because we met farmers who are really so busy usually that it's quite hard to get to meet them. But of course they were wondering what on earth we were up to. And then the feature of interest in this picture is down here. This is a nuclear listening post left over from them. It was last used in the 80s. Up to the wind farm, and that tiny speck at the bottom here, that's me. To give you an idea of the scale. We met people who are going about their business, and in this case I had to buy a half a barrel. My arm twisted, but that was really nice, just to bump into people who are going about their business. And then people had us in for coffee, you know, got chatting and were invited in, and the ex-postman the retired postman had us in, and then he said, oh, I bet Maureen would like to talk to you. So he phoned up Maureen, and then we went for coffee with Maureen. And so all this sort of incidental connections, you know, somebody said, oh, you're just wandering around chatting to people. And it's like, well, yes, that is how you find out about things. Lynn has a drone, which has been the most fantastic tool, not only because it takes these fabulous photographs, but also because people are really interested, and our social media, we've put these pictures up, and then we get a lot of people say, his house is just up there, I'd love to see my granny's house, and you know, I'm in Canada, but my family comes from somewhere over here, and would it be possible to see what that looks like? And so yes, we were looking sort of from a distance, from above, we're looking close up at the flowers and animals, at the soil, reading about the history, looking at old maps. And we were thinking about all the different communities, and thinking about how to connect with all of them, because I think this is probably where it is a little bit different working in a rural area where people are dispersed. So there were the long-time local residents, the people who we were sort of bumping into, and some of the recent residents who were a bit more reticent. There's the diaspora, a lot of which is in places quite locally like Huntley and Lumsden and so on, but then some as far away as Australia and Canada and the States. And then we also wanted to tell people who didn't know about the Cabrach about it, and encourage them to come and visit. In addition to informally meeting local people, we also did run a formal workshop for locals, and we got Vanilla Ink, the jeweler Megan Falconer working for Vanilla Ink came and did a jewelry workshop. And because the area is so underpopulated, we were actually able to go to every household and take a flyer and just knock on the door and invite people. So we didn't advertise it, we did it by word of mouth and face to face, which I think you probably wouldn't do in well, you couldn't do in a city, but is the way people really respond in a rural area, in my experience. So this was actually not the workshop, this is when the silver came back from being cast in Birmingham, and people getting their finished results back. We had a little coffee session at the Grouse Inn. Our social media was really good. I think some of you have probably been following us, and certainly Instagram has been good for sort of arts contacts. But Facebook is really great for local things, and things like Cabrach Memories, which is run by a local person but has membership around the world, was a really great way for connecting with the people who'd left the area. And then we did other events which were for local people and to bring people in. So this is Eden from the sculpture workshop doing a cuttlefish casting. With the jewelry and these little metal things, we were thinking about mementos, because again we were thinking about people who'd left and people who'd stayed, and how you carry your memories when you leave. The local countryside rangers, who are funded by the wind farm, worked with us, and we did some guided walks. So this is an evening photography walk, which was very lovely. And really that, brings me on to the importance of some of the partners we worked with, because you know, as artists, you have one set of skills, but you can extend so much if you have other people's help. So Moray Arts Development and Engagement supported us with sort of advice, and when we needed someone to sound out about things. Cabrach Trust gave us access to facilities. The Doronell Rangers helped us with guiding people, and the Community Association were just really brilliant about making sure there was milk so we could have coffee at the workshops, and emailing people, and you know, these things are just so important. So when it came to developing work, we were in quite a good place to respond to what people care about, and we had quite a strong sense of purpose, actually, that the art wasn't just art for art's sake, it was art with a purpose, and the purpose was to tell the story of what was distressing everybody, which is depopulation and isolation. So I mean, there are, I don't know, scores of these empty houses everywhere, many of them inhabited recently, up till 20 years ago. So people remember seeing their lights, and the story that sort of really touched us was how people in the winter always waited for their neighbours' lights coming on to make sure they were all right, and that now where there used to be little constellations of lights, there's just dark, and that became the centre of some of the work that we made. And we used materials that reflected the area as well, so things that hadn't rotted away, like glass and metal. The windows that reflect the views that would have been visible to people living in the houses, curtains that still move in the windows, which gives this sort of ghostly sense of somebody moving behind the windows, and the iron everywhere. So that gave us our palette of materials that would tie into the landscape, which cast iron at SSW, cast glass at Northlands, and we used fabric as well. And then we had exhibitions and events. And again, I think this face-to-face thing, which seems to be really important in rural areas, instead of just putting up an exhibition and leaving it, to stay with the exhibition and run it more like an event, so that Lynn and I were there to talk to people. So they were shorter runs, but we were there. And in the local area, we were able to, people recognized immediately what the work was about, and were able to sort of tell us stories about what connected with it. And further afield, the work was like the stimulus to tell the stories to people who weren't familiar with the area. This is the showing in the Cabrach where we started. And this building is now being redeveloped as a craft distillery by the Cabrach Trust. So it was really nice that this exhibition, which in the end reflected on the past, was in the place that is sort of like the beginning of the future stage of development. And you can see here some of the work that we made. These are actual portraits of real places in the Cabrach, and some are ghost town, the cast iron ones of the inhabited houses. And we also made a range of jewellery because we were very aware that we wanted to be more part of the life. Instead of just observers of the life, we wanted to be sort of more actively part of what was going on. So this jewellery is going to be sold through the Cabrach Trust in aid of their work with the community. And in the same way, Lynn was really good with the drone photos. If people did ask in social media to have an area photographed, she did go back and photograph it so that they could see their houses or their families' houses, so that there was a bit more of a circular, not just observing, being a bit more actively involved. So this is the list of where we've shown in the Cabrach, in Glenlivet, which joins the Cabrach, Moray College, Huntly. These were all places with a lot of people from the Cabrach now living. And then we took it down to Leith, and it's going to be in Aberdeen over the summer, although we can't stay in Aberdeen for the whole summer, sadly. Here, this is talking to some of the students at Moray College of Art. And for one girl in particular, I know that it was the first time she'd seen work made to do with this area. She was from a farming family, and it was just like a transformative experience for her to see work that wasn't just like stuff in a city gallery, that was about things she recognized. And she has now sort of gone from strength to strength in her own work. So that was really great. And on the left here, that's 3 generations of people from the Cabrach, and this is actually on their second visit to the exhibition, because the mother, Agnes, on the right here with the spotty coat, she grew up in one of the houses that's now derelict, and she came with her daughter in the middle there, and they came again to visit to bring their granddaughter along as well. And a lot of people, well, several people brought photos with them, fantastic photos. And again, this was something where we could put them up on social media, share them to Cabrach Memories, and put them in touch with the Cabrach Trust. I love this photo on the right. This is the parents' race at one of the Cabrach schools, which of course is now closed down. But the Cabrach Trust is building an archive as part of their Cabrach Lives project. So we've been able to feed into that. And so that's where we are so far. And what next? We have applied for some money from a wind farm to look at the future of the Cabrach. This is the distillery, which is now the craft distillery, which is developed, but no, the future is tied up with wind farms. And here you can see the green dots are existing turbines, and the blue and orange dots are proposed turbines. And the people in the Cabrach, most of them live in here, in between them. So it'd be a huge change, and that's where we are so far.
Lovely to see everybody here. My name is Virginia Hutchison, and I'm an artist currently based in both the Isle of Lewis and Glasgow. Mary asked me to join this conversation to discuss some of the challenges of sustaining an arts practice in rural areas, and to talk specifically about a project that I recently undertook on the Isle of Lewis, Stories of Radical Landownership in North Lewis. I was actually quite glad to see that Kirsten had also advertised it as how to run a successful arts project in rural areas, because I think the challenges that we all encountered during this process and during this particular period in time helped to shape the outcome of the project. And it also in some ways makes me question what the measure of success actually is. I first met Mary in Aberdeenshire when I worked at the Scottish Sculpture Workshop over a period of about 10 years. And so working within a rural context was very familiar to me before I moved partially up to the Isle of Lewis 4 years ago. Working within an island context has, however, proved to be more challenging than working on the mainland in terms of access to resources, cultural provision, job, education opportunities, and obviously logistics of travel. In other ways, working within an island context, such as the Isle of Lewis during the pandemic, and in a decade that's seen the number of community land buyouts in the Outer Hebrides reach over 6, has been enlightening, empowering, and aspirational. So, this is the story of the Gosson Estate in North Lewis, the largest community land buyout in Scotland, and my effort to gather together the narratives that surround it from a distance. I'm also going to try and play a couple of clips from the audio recordings, so what I have to do is I have to turn this right up and take my earphones out. If you guys can't hear it, maybe turn it up on your keyboards as well.
was very much it was very much, you know, the kind of the good cop, bad cop scenario, because Norman came from years of being involved in big projects in the oil industry, and I came from community. And we had an initial meeting with the landlords, which went quite badly, it has to be said. But at the end of it, we said, well, this is what the community wants. You've said that before. How do you know? We can say that with certainty because the ballot has been held, and this was the result.
A landmark of sea, level ground, open country, full of rushes, a grassy plain.
And so from that point on, the landlords appointed a land agent to work on their behalf. And that's who Norman and I dealt with. And he virtually couldn't look us in the eye the first meeting we had with him. It would have been so much easier for him to have dealt with another professional with no contact, no connection, you know, no relationship.
Lochstrianeva, Lochhusta, Lotchejuising, Boonkaro, Malakro.
You can just imagine the situation where they would have been sitting on two sides of a table, you know, and talking about this piece of land, and that's all it was, and there'd be X number of acres, X thousand of people living there, X number of villages. What's it worth?
Slaka,
Earth,
Juchwe,
soil,
Paafkevlinje,
a hillock, a rock in the sea.
And if you're dealing with it in a kind of third-party situation, where it's not actually your own money, or your own land,
Fertile
or your own house that you're talking about, you're
dwelling place,
doing it for somebody, then
pasture
it's so
land.
much easier to do. And it's almost a bit of a game. And I have to say, you know, some of the later meetings that we had in Edinburgh, let me say, because we had to engage our own lawyers eventually. You know, we had lawyers, but you know, we absolutely had to have our lawyers at the table when it came to the kind of checking out due diligence but it was frustrating in the extreme, because you then saw this relationship playing out in real time.
Produced in collaboration with the Gosson Estate, Community Land Scotland and the Stove Network, this project brings together narratives surrounding the community land buyout of the Gosson Estate in 2007. Curated during the COVID pandemic in 2020-2021, the project weaves together local audio archives and interviews and brings them into contemporary conversations surrounding community land ownership. With access and social distancing measures in mind, the project has taken the form of a series of cast bronze artefacts temporarily sited in the landscape of North Lewis. Embedded with digital QR codes, the artefacts link visitors directly to the audio works via mobile phone. Underpinning the interviews are recitals of the Gaelic place names that define North Lewis, a gentle call and response between Gaelic and English, though not a direct translation, through the landscape, geography and history of the area. Looking out onto the Barvas Moor, visitors can be mistaken for thinking it's an empty landscape, but listening closely to the Gaelic expressions used to describe the environment of North Lewis gives a sense of the intimate and complex relationship between people and place. A language embedded within local culture and knowledge and not always translatable. Permeating the voices within the audio works are recordings made from the constant movements and tectonic shifts beneath the Earth's surface. Produced by artist Stephen Hurrell, the seismic sounds provide layers to the stories and issues that surround engagement with the landscape. Hurrell's work with seismic sounds and with Gaelic-speaking communities in Barra weaves closely into the stories of radical land ownership in North Lewis. Where these conversations meet and overlap present opportunities for wider discussions around land reform in Scotland. From the outset, this project was problematic. I was attempting to navigate a landscape, a community, and a language that I didn't know, to unpick the events that led up to the buyout and the effect that it's had on the community since. A daunting project to do justice to, and particularly one so politically significant. But to embark and deliver a socially engaged project such as this during a pandemic with restricted travel and with social distancing in place was a difficult endeavour. In addition to this, the project was being managed from central and southern Scotland, and while certain aspects of this worked really well, Zoom meetings were never going to be able to replace real-time experience. One's native country, a hamlet or farm, land unploughed for a year, a defile, passage, pass, or mountain gorge, a soft marshy field or plain, a plain, a level flat spot, the brow of the hill, a strip of arable land, a field or plain.
Now, the discussions, the early discussions about community ownership had already started. It's like everything else. Do you wait for things to be wrong before you start going for things? I mean, people often ask us here in the Galston situation, you know, what was the trigger? Because of course we weren't like Egg with Schellenberg. We weren't a Gia situation. We didn't have that kind of landlord-tenant relationship, which had broken down irretrievably. But what you had was a very passive relationship where it was a wasted asset for those living here.
In 2007, the community in the Galston estate were galvanised to pursue a community buyout after a series of quite large economic and environmental decisions were made by absentee landlords. At the point where I began to work with them, the estate had already established a business model and a board of community members. They were also generating income to build on the infrastructure of the area, to support business startups, improve health and well-being, culture and education. Although North Lewis has a long political history, it felt that the community were starting from scratch in terms of the democratic processes that were being used to develop the URAS, which is the Galston Estate Trust, and to define community values. The voices and needs of the community are very much at the heart of these localised decision-making processes. Even the objects curated in the local museum have a direct relationship to somebody in the area. It was this ethos of creating new narratives through personal relationships that I very much relied on. Transparency was also key to this process, as building a sense of trust with the Galston estate in terms of how this project might take shape was important, particularly as the project was constantly changing and evolving. I know for the URAS, navigating this ambiguous territory could not have been easy. For me, it was very much about identifying what I had available at my fingertips and how I could communicate this to all the stakeholders in the project. With any thoughts of social engagement firmly off the table, I turned the project on its head and began by making a series of silent, soon-to-be talking objects and worked backwards, snatching moments of socially distanced walks and interviews, uncovering layers of archive research that the Trust was building on, and learning how to understand the politics, history, and the new landscape of North Lewis. A hill, a steep height, a little ford or shallow part of the river reaching from bank to bank, a knoll, a peat bank, a summer grazing place for cattle, a point of land, the land between the Mac and the moor, enclosed grazing between the arable land and the open moor.
I think that what the Trust, what the URAS brought to the pandemic response was the stability of a structure providing infrastructure which was already tested and established, and I think it's absolutely right and proper to call it an anchor organisation in that regard, because the role of the ORAS is not just to dig ditches or just to run the village show or just to assign crops. It's the role, it is a strategic role right across the community.
A circular fold
Achieved
for sheep or cattle.
to some extent by working on it
A green
by
spot
itself,
by the wine
but
bins
more
upstream.
importantly by working with others. So I think it's bringing that
Soft
mindset
box.
that's made the difference.
The outside peat in a peat bank. With regards to the constantly evolving social and cultural politics that define specific, often civic spaces, where practice evolves around how viewers can become physically involved with what they see, and how visual hooks from works of art or architecture can create a sense of involvement. With particular reference to how memory and learning is affected by automatic emotional responses to art objects, I work in collaboration with artists, students and groups in wider communities to explore how different forms of artistic engagement influence the interaction we have with our environments. Taking a lead from the processes involved in creative production, each object considers how shared experiences can facilitate conversation. In this case, the art object was taken as a point of departure for new work. The fluidity of the project reflected the bizarre times we were living in, but it also allowed us to leave the project open for new narratives as they developed within the community. This approach allowed us to collectively discuss ideas surrounding authorship or ownership, and to question the frameworks we have in place for critique and evaluation, or indeed success. Over the past 15 years, the URAS has worked hard at promoting a sense of ownership within the community. This is the keystone to a grassroots democracy such as this, the benefits of which have been recognised by the community at large, including me, specifically during the pandemic. The generosity and trust that I felt working with the Gosling estate, even when things fell apart, allowed me to fail a little bit and to bring it all back into focus. What I take away from this project, amongst many, many other things, is that bigger is most definitely not better. Silos are not really conducive to creative development, and very rarely do arm's length projects turn out the way you think they're going to.
Skripeva. Stak askala. Slakach eiche. Slak nkuch eiche. Sliav go. Stichbisten.
So anyway, that's where we are. So that was 2007 when we got our sassins from Simon Fraser on the most windy day, the stormiest day, and the ceremony took place because of the historical significance of it in the yard of Gosson farmhouse.
Topper Julan. Path Givlinia.
A green, plain meadow,
Paul you
pleasant country, land ploughed for a second crop, a place of habitation, one's native country, a hamlet or farm, land unploughed for a year, a defile, passage, pass or mountain gorge.
But what I will say, Ginny, and I think it's important never to lose sight of this, while we don't dwell on the challenges or dwell on the negatives, you know, that's the risk and the benefit of democracy.
Cheers.